All right, welcome to this week's podcast. This is part 2 with Rick Kievits. We're going to be getting into a little bit of a review of who Jocko Willink is. He's someone that has been really helpful to me, and Rick actually introduced me to him, and he's actually gone to the next step with it as well, as he has done a little bit of actually office training with it, and has trained some of it on his book. So without further ado, let's talk about Jocko Willink.
Yeah.
Tell us about Jocko and from your research and
So I was introduced to him too, by a friend, and I watched some 3-minute video on YouTube, one of Jocko's videos, with the voice and everything.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the voice that sold me; it was the message right away. It aligned so much with me personally that I bought the book, and as soon as I read the book, I was like, "There's so much we can learn from this."
Yeah.
And I was doing trainings as a facilitator, so I was creating trainings at my work. And I was like, I want to create something on this, and so I did.
Yeah.
So
a little bit of background, with Jocko too. It's like he's a Navy SEAL with U.S. and he actually fought like in crazy combat in Iraq, like during the heat of it.
Yep.
And so you should look up his TED Talk. We'll include that with this as well, but kind of a good summary of him. But man, he's very with Jocko, it's like he's very humble, which is really, we talked about that last week about how humility is really important. And he doesn't, when you look at him, he's just jacked. He's a big man. And so, but you wouldn't think he'd be
like
humble.
A Navy SEAL, doesn't he?
He looks like a Navy SEAL, but you just think like, oh man, like this guy, he's gonna kind of rule over you and not be a helpful guy. But man, he's been really impactful with a lot of his advice between fatherhood, between business, and just having a mentality of like, let's just move forward. So tell us about his book.
So I mean, I read the book, and it's a simple read, and that's not a negative. That's like a really positive, because you can overcomplicate things so much. But it puts it out there in a way where you can just read it and walk away with it and apply it right away, right?
Yep.
And so in many ways, I sometimes look back at things, and in hindsight, things make sense. And in hindsight, it makes sense why this book and his principles align, why they hit home for me, right? Yeah. Because I want to say that a lot of it, life happens at us and comes at us, and it's out of our control.
Yeah.
Things seem to take place in a manner in which we feel like we're a victim.
Yeah.
And things like that. And truthfully so. There is a lot of stuff that comes. But as anybody knows, your response to anything dictates your outcome, really. And so I think the first thing that you need to do if you want to have a positive response, and that's usually the thing, is taking ownership. And I think that's why this book is so powerful, because it's in most times the hardest thing to do.
Yep.
But it's the necessary thing.
Yeah.
And so that's...
And I think like even just a simple thing, it's like I'm constantly trying to think of ways how to be more disciplined or wake up even earlier. And the principle is like just some of the things that Jocko will say in his podcast or in his book. It's like, of course, when you wake up, it's not going to feel very good, but you gotta get up, because it's going to feel better long term if you get up and get moving. If you get your workout in, and that's what I appreciate. Because sometimes there's all these messages in the world that, I mean, sometimes it's necessary, like you're saying, but it's like sometimes like it's okay, just you deserve a break. And it's like sometimes I'm like, no, like I want to have a really good impact on my children and raise them and love them. I want to have a really good business and do a good job for my clients.
Yeah.
And I want to be a good husband. And there's only so many minutes a day. I just got to get up and get moving. I got to do it. And so he's kind of like, wake up, get moving, and this is why it's important. And that's like really good message to hear in our society.
Because one of your points is, as you're talking through that, is okay. We can choose every time. We can choose to do what's easy, and what feels good, or we can choose the opposite of what's easy and feels good. So it might be painful or whatever, but it's often the thing that's also right.
Yeah.
And so not taking ownership often feels good.
Yeah. In the short term.
Oh yeah,
I felt short term, it's like it feels good not taking ownership.
Yeah.
we're not talking about like taking ownership of everything. Like I can't control my wife's emotions. My wife can't control my emotions, but I can control my emotions. One of my favorite quotes my dad would say when I was a little kid, he'd say, Jason, your brother Dan does not make you mad. You make yourself mad. And I would get even more mad about that. But that is so true. Yeah. It's like, no, it's like we can kind of, in a sense, work through things. Now, if things obviously go horrifically wrong and you need to get the help that you need to get your help with, but eventually you got to like grab what you can own and move forward, because otherwise you're going to feel like you're in a sea being tossed back and forth and you're just not going to be able to recover. But a lot of times like these little decisions that don't feel good in the immediate actually are the decisions that need to be made, and it'll yield a good crop, so to speak, long term. That you'll be so thankful you made those good decisions, whether that's harboring bitterness towards people or whether it's overlooking an insult, just moving on, like what you talked about last week about like some of the corporation can get into gossip, things like that, but if you can just kind of move past it and be a positive influence, it can be so helpful. So what are some of the key principles that when you're teaching on, and what were some of the things that kind of came to mind that were helpful?
So the first thing when you invited me was, okay, the principles for me personally, right? But beyond him.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think ownership is a mindset, really. And so some people, you can choose to have that mindset or not. Yeah. And so for me, it is a choice, taking ownership or not. You can technically argue it is a choice, right? I can choose to take ownership when something happens to me, or when I didn't wake up and so I got to work late or whatever. Yeah. Things like that. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to own up for the consequence as a result of, taking ownership or not. And so I believe that people want to improve. I believe people want to have meaning in life. Yeah. And I believe the biggest way of doing that is by taking on responsibility. Yeah. And that takes ownership. And so when you have responsibilities and things go on the opposite of as expected, or maybe south or whatever, ownership is the first step to make something right or to improve. Yeah. Because looking away will not. And so that's the big thing. But then the second thing for me, and this can be argued either way too, is I choose to believe that the consequence of whatever I choose or don't choose is a result of what I did or didn't do. Although there's many things that are out of our control. But what I'm trying to do with that is I'm trying to look at it to put it back on me, to say, okay, what could I have done? What should I have done? Those kinds of things, because I'm putting it back on me, and the energy is back focused on me to say, okay, here's what you did, and here's what you should have done if you wanted this as a consequence. Yeah. And there's always something that we can learn.
Yeah. Sometimes it's painful.
It is very painful.
It's like, oh man, I was wrong.
But it's the right pain.
Yeah, it is.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Well, it is, especially, if you want to get better, it's like sometimes it's like, oh, I didn't handle that situation well, and you know, be really proud and just cause that rift if it's with the person, and cause it, or I can be humble and work it out. But
because so what I was actually trying to say, and I'm trying to read through my notes as well, is I think once you take ownership of that outcome or the consequence, so I did something, here was the consequence. Once I take ownership of that, I feel like I empower myself to change the variable, which usually is me. The time I put into something, the energy I put into something, whatever. For example, this podcast right now. Yeah. You send me in a short, little brief 3 points of, okay, here's some things I want to go over. Yeah. If I didn't read that and I didn't put any work into a little bit of preparation, this probably would have gone a lot different than if I did do some preparation.
Well, you're the man.
Well, I know I'm not, but I'm saying, absolutely. The consequence is different depending on what you put in.
Yeah. And I think that, absolutely. And so from a daily life standpoint, just taking ownership of a lot of stuff that as you get older, it's like, I have 4 kids.
I just want to say, this drives my wife nuts, by the way, that I am this way.
Yeah. Well, it's a yin and a yang, or whatever people want to say about that. But that's why a spouse is wonderful. But
that's right.
I think that it's important, because and I think one thing that's just a pet peeve of mine, it's like, whether I want to believe it or not, I am the leader of my children, and along with my wife, it's like, but some people, they just don't even want to acknowledge what you own already, even if you're not claiming it. It's like, man,
it's easier. It's easier, and it's so easy. We can all find people to point at, right, or make this is why I'm not the way I should be, or this is why I didn't go to school, or that professor's fault. I got to see, or whatever. It's so easy, and we all have people that we can think of that we can blame, or situations, or whatever. But that doesn't fix anything. Just doing that, it actually makes us angry. To what your dad, I think you quoted. It makes you angry when you start doing those things. And you lose so much energy and time. So if you just shift it back on, okay, I just got this grade from the professor. I need to study harder. And this is just a simple example, or this just happened to me. Could be very tragic stuff. How am I going to respond? How do I want to respond? How do I want to look back at it? That takes discipline. To Jocko's other principle. Discipline equals freedom. But I think it's ownership first.
And I think like the big thing that was the paradigm shift for Jocko was they had, what do they call it? They had friendly fire amongst each other. So they were going to do in Fallujah. They're going to go into battle, and they end up doing the exact opposite nightmare of a situation. And that nightmare was they end up killing one of their people, Iraqi soldiers on their coalition, on their team, and everybody gets back and from that, and so they're gonna meet and talk about it. And Jocko is one of the key leaders for that whole plan of attack, and everybody, he could have blamed miscommunication with the Iraqi group, the miscommunication with another Marine Corps that was another team, and could have done that. But what he realized was like, that's going to get us nowhere. It is my fault. And I think that's so important as a leader to say, we had a mission, and I think that goes so far with employees that if a leader would just say, we had this mission, we had this marketing plan, we had this event, we had this plan, it didn't go successful, so it's my fault. And I think for me, when you see someone as impressive as Jocko say that, and as well decorated of a soldier,
right?
Oh, so much weight, and he's like for me personally, that's like he's the ultimate dude. He's a jiu-jitsu, he's jacked, it's like, and he's fought in real wars, and he's kind, and he's a cool dude. But when you hear that, that's inspiring. To see that. So.
And there's the weight. That's such a big thing. And okay, so tie that to just me personally. That's why I love the concept. But then also, if you look just at the world, and what's going on these days, and when I look at just at work, regardless of which workplace I was in, so many times do we do the opposite of taking ownership. No, it was this person's fault, or he's not doing what he's expected to do. He keeps showing up late for work, those kinds of things. Or from a world perspective, everybody's pointing fingers at each other. And we could be so much more effective by changing that mindset a bit. So the more you can push that message out of ownership, the better. And so what I did was I reached out to, so I was doing some facilitations, and I reached out to his company, which is Echelon Front LLC, I believe, and I said, hey, because you can't just take somebody's book and do your own trainings on it. I first have to email out and
ask permission.
So I asked, and so
that company's owned by Jocko.
And so they emailed me back and said, we love it when people spread the message and convey these principles. So go ahead and make it your training. And so that was awesome. So I did, and that's where the business piece kind of comes in, because there's so much that we can learn from a business aspect. And so one thing that I always start my trainings with is some mindsets. Because I truly believe it is how you walk into certain situations that have a huge influence on what you get out of something. And so some of the things that I start out with this ownership training is, to what extent do you intend to get value out of today? Because if you wrote yourself low on that, forget what I'm about to talk about. And to what extent are you prepared to engage personally? Are you going to talk or not? That kind of stuff. Are you prepared to take risks, to learn, and take responsibility for that person that's sitting next to you? and depending on how you rate yourself right at the beginning there, you can already make a assumption on what that person is going to get out of it. I can already kind of tell whether you're going to get a lot out of it.
Yeah.
And that you control.
Yeah.
Regardless of what I'm about to talk about.
Yeah.
Or how I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I love starting that way, not only because I think it's correct, I think it sets the tone.
Yeah.
I think it says something like, oh, damn.
Mm-hmm.
I got to step it up.
Yeah. And I think the big thing with the training, too, it's like people that are going to this training know that it's going to be a training.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy. Like, I'm not that old that I feel like I am. I'm 33. I try to say it at every podcast. I'm 33, getting a receding hairline.
Yeah.
But it's easy to become a curmudgeon and not desire to pursue anything or pursue betterment. And I just think it's important because there's still so much growth. When you think about the growth in college, those 4 years, I get back to that a lot. It's like, man, I grew a lot during that time.
Yeah.
And I just think it's good, important. Those questions are important for engagement. People are just really taking a step back and say, okay, I need to kind of engage right now because there's still a lot of growth that can happen.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the other messages that I like to deliver, and I did during that training, was it's a mindset first, and then the fact that there's, we talked about it a little bit earlier, there's so much stuff that is going to affect you and that's impacting your life that really is outside of what your control.
Yeah.
Whether it was my dad that did something, my mom who did something, whatever, right? Outside of my control. So, again, you could sit back and say it wasn't my fault. Yeah. I'm not here to blame. It was my, deal, their fault. Mm-hmm. But the ultimate thing about ownership, it doesn't matter whose fault it was, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the fact that it's your responsibility to go deal with it.
Yeah. Right?
You need to be that employee that's productive. You need to make a career out of something for yourself. Mm-hmm. You need to be a good dad. You need to do all these things.
Yeah. And it's like sometimes like it's comforting that it's not comforting, but short term you're just like, it's easy to just be like, okay, I have an excuse to be a terrible husband tonight because I had a tough day at work.
Yeah.
It's like, no. Like, I need to, as a Christian, I pray about it, I think about it, and it's like, I need to ask God to help me, like, come home, take ownership of that, seek help, and then move forward. But it's really easy to not take ownership of just let that affect the whole rest of the day.
Yeah. And that's actually one of my challenges because I am so hard that way on the ownership piece.
Yeah.
I could almost put too much on you sometimes too, and that's a balance. But without that first step of ownership, forget fixing a problem effectively for sure. And so the five. So if we want to just shift more onto the business piece of it, the reason I thought this training was is so good and the concept is so good is because at work you got politics, bureaucracy, you got people worried about their pride and how they're perceived and all these other things. Yeah. And they just want to look good and they want to get promotions and throw somebody else under the bus and things like that. And there's so many times that you hear, well, I didn't know what I was supposed to do, or that person didn't do what was expected. My employees aren't doing what I told them to do, or they didn't do as good of a job as I would have liked, or things like that. Or sometimes it could also be the opposite way where you're like, well, my boss is not making the correct decisions and things like that. And Jocko really does a good way of tackling those conversations from both angles. Yeah. So for me as a supervisor, tackling the conversations of, okay, my employees aren't doing what's expected. They're not delivering the productivity that I want, etc. Or from another perspective, he also delivers really good topics and advice on, hey, my boss is not making the right decisions. He's not getting it. Yeah. He's just not seeing it. Those kinds of things. Yeah. Because you hear that so much. Yeah. And so the big thing there is just like, okay, well, once you start having those conversations, help each other see. Right? Yeah. If my boss is missing something, and I think I am seeing it, well, it's my responsibility to help him see it. Mm-hmm. It's not, if he doesn't know he's missing something, then how is he supposed to?
It's really good in the book because he gives some pragmatic ways to help them see
It's a great
because there's so much pressure. Mm-hmm. I'm sure as however big, if you're the owner,
Yeah.
to perform, so you can be really defensive. But he gives some really good examples of just going side by side and showing that you care. And then you deliver it that way versus an anonymous note or a
so
Yelp
tough,
review,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because especially at work too, when you know what the stakes are,
Yeah,
it's easy to first do that because you don't want to look bad, you don't
Yeah.
want to get written up, you don't want to get fired, you
Yeah.
don't want any of those things on you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's made easier to say, well, he didn't do what was expected of him, or my boss is just not getting it.
yeah, yeah.
Or I'm not getting the support that I need.
Mm-hmm.
That's way easier to say, well, I'm not doing as effective of a job delivering the expectations or helping my boss see the things that he needs to see.
Yeah. And I think one thing too in that book, he also does a really good job of, like what you just said, he goes after the leaders too. So like, for example, he gave an example when he was giving advice to a business leader, and he was really all out of sorts because some of his employees were applying to other jobs. And Jocko goes, time out. What are you doing right now that makes them want to leave?
Yeah.
And that's a very good question. So it's not just like we're younger in our careers, so it's like we do have to have a servant attitude, to help that problem. And at least that's my attitude right now. But he also goes after, but he gives instruction to leaders too, like how to be a better leader, and that's really good. So it's a two-way street. So that's why it's really helpful, probably in corporations. That's why you're passionate about.
Well, we each have a responsibility
Mm-hmm.
in the same situation most often. So there may have been something that takes place where somebody didn't do what was expected of them. Say it was my employee.
Yeah.
And so it was my responsibility to make sure that he knew what was expected of him. And in a way, it also was his responsibility to ask me if he didn't know what was expected of him, So it's a two-way street type of thing. So the person needs to take ownership, and I need to take ownership in that situation, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a two-way street. And he even, heard Simon Sinek, I don't know if I said his last name right, but he said, if you make the hire as an employer, you got to come alongside to help them. You can't just sit. That goes both ways, like with the ownership too. It's like you got to take ownership of that hire and then really come alongside and lovingly help and instruct. Because it's easy too when you can be someone can be so cutthroat as an employer to just say, well, we just hired you, that's it. Versus, getting on ground level and really helping. So I think that's why the message is really helpful all the way around, because it's like all levels.
It's so liberating in a way. If you really want to, when you take ownership, it's liberating because what you're saying back is, I have control.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah.
And so the book has 12 principles.
Yep.
As you know. But trainings to be effective, I like to keep them within 2 to 3 hours or so. So you only pick a few principles. So I picked 5 principles to go over, and I felt like were most fitting in the setting and in the environment that I was in at the time. And so the first one that is principle 1, which you can't miss that one obviously, which is owning everything.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where the extreme word comes in, because you can define ownership as one thing, and then extreme ownership is saying basically, own everything that somehow impacts your life.
Yeah.
And that is tough, But
it is. I think even like just sometimes our excuses. I think that's why it's a good title, because sometimes say ownership, we can kind of be like, ownership, but it's like extreme. That's just
it needs
simple.
to be radical.
Yeah, it needs to be radical, but it's it's really helpful. So back to the to some of the training, say 2 to 3 hours is kind of the the each session type of thing that you've done, and is that
and that one. And so the real idea then that I took away from that first principle from a business standpoint, and then for me personally as a leader, is the leader must own everything. So from a leadership standpoint within business, I think that could be perceived basically as such a thing as, you must own everything that impacts your business, regardless of where I'm at in the position, whether I'm a CEO, whether I'm a vice president, whether I'm, pushing the mail cart around.
Yep.
In certain ways, it impacts me, and depending on my responsibilities and where I'm at, I can choose to respond certain ways. And so I think the main takeaway there was, own that. That just impacted your company or your team, your project, your task.
Yeah.
how you're going to respond. But own it first. Because your responsibility is a lot less productive if you don't take that ownership.
Absolutely. So then the rest of the principles, how has that been formatted and things like that? Yeah.
So I'm actually going to have to scroll a little bit here.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So it's really from a leadership perspective, right? So he mainly focuses on the leader.
Yes.
And so, some of his concepts are there's no bad teams, it's bad leaders, and he talks through that. And I do choose to believe that is true. Although you can probably make an argument that there is such a thing as bad teams. Yeah. That's still not how you want to go into situations. Even if you know your team is bad. You still have, because then it's still up to the leader to make sure that bad team turns into a good team.
Yeah, and the way that it can be is if everybody's on board with the principles, you can reposition people too, potentially.
Yeah. So it's up to you, not them. And if your team still doesn't perform after a year, it's your fault. You're not making any changes, right? Yeah. So then the belief one is one I focused on too, because I believe belief is such an important thing. I used some soccer analogies because I played soccer in college. Yep. And belief goes such a long way. I don't know what percentages would be, but I think it makes up more than, in many ways, skill. It can go against skill. Yeah. You see so many times in sports where people had more belief and whatever than skill than the team that was on the other end, and they had more skill. But yet the team would believe one for whatever reason, and there's probably various other reasons too, I know, but belief is so important. Once you start believing in yourself, you're going to start accomplishing so much more. So believe that you can overcome whatever it is. The one that I liked the most was controlling the ego, because I think that's where most of us get hung up on or stuck on so much. Me included, because and my ego has changed a lot, and it's still not where it should be, but it's definitely better than where it was. And it's a lot easier now to own up to something that I did wrong, or something that maybe my teammate did wrong, but if I had just told them one little thing, they probably would have done it right. So that's on me. And that's such a big thing, because controlling the ego gives you such more accurate perspective, right? And it's so humbling and necessary, and it makes you look at things the way you more likely to look at things the way you should look at them. But control of the ego blocks the ego would block everything if you don't. Yeah.
And if you're in an environment where people are on the same page with this, that's such a liberating group to be a part of. Because it's about the mission. Yeah. And if you believe in one another and you believe in the mission, you believe that you can have an impact. And then you can be vulnerable with one another. That seems like that has been a good culture to be in.
And I think a couple of things that I try to do now more mindfully for myself is just say something happens and my employee didn't do what they were supposed to do. So in some way it does kind of kick in a pride thing for me, because it's like, oh dang, I take that personal, because it's like, okay, why are we not performing, and this is going to look bad on me in ways. But at the same time, I right away then, when that feeling kicks in, I try to ask myself the question, what should I have done, or what did I not do that kind of thing, because that usually gives me the answer that I already knew, but that I in that moment especially needed to hear. And that gives me the accurate perspective to then at least walk in with the right approach when I have a conversation, and now we're having a productive conversation about, next time let's do this, I forgot to tell you this, or whatever. And how much different does that conversation go than if I don't control the ego and say, you messed up, you know?
Guns a-blazing.
Or the other way around too, you know, it's my boss's fault I didn't succeed. Well, how about you help him or her see the things that they're not seeing currently, or those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just the ego is super important to check it, because man, oh man. Pride goes before the fall, in a sense. If you're just over. I mean, if you're just all about being proud and defending your position versus being humble.
So the two other principles that I have that I really enjoy in that was cover and move was one, and that's really all about teamwork.
Yeah.
Right. And there's so many times too where I feel like conversations are like, that's not my responsibility.
Yep.
Or I ask somebody to help X person out. So I ask Y to help X out. Well, that's not my job. Or conversations such as those. And that's not what cover and move is about. Or ownership. Because whatever that task is, or the help is, where that help is needed, affects the team.
Yeah.
It affects that person, which means it affects you, and it affects the company.
Yeah.
And so cover and move is trying to get that mindset of we're all impacting each other in one way, shape, or form, and helping them see that.
Yeah.
And helping them see how if you help me with something, this is how it's going to help both of us in a way.
Yeah.
And so I love that concept because I truly believe cover and move is basically breaking down silos.
Yeah.
And how many times do you hear about silos wherever you go, also in corporations?
Yeah.
And silos in ways are okay because you do have to focus within your responsibilities. You can't just say, okay, well, whatever.
Yeah.
But they can also hurt communication and productivity and efficiency so much if you don't break those down. And I think cover and move is one of the ways.
That's huge.
And so when actually that was the one principle of the 5 that I kind of facilitated on, that we had the longest discussions on with the people that I was in with the room.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, it's pretty clear why.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes people feel like they're not being recognized when they're doing it. But if you're in a cohesive group that people are all bought into it, then that's just such a liberating thing. But then it gets back to ownership. It's like, well, do what you can with what you got to the best of your ability. So.
Yeah, and that ties also with making sure that cover and move is also about making sure every team member recognize how critical they are to the big mission, right?
Absolutely.
So whatever the company's mission is, and you got certain people with different responsibilities, and obviously you got hierarchies.
Yeah.
And the people at entry level, so me pushing the mail cart.
Yeah.
In ways.
Yeah.
Help those people see how they impact the next person or this person or the overall mission.
Yep.
Because every team member is critical. And if that member is not doing what they're supposed to, help them see how that impacts everybody else.
Yeah, for sure.
And how important they are. Because that's what I hear a lot too sometimes is people do not see that connection. And so if they are not seeing it, forget about them understanding it. Or people are not truly feeling that they are valued that way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's so important. And then the last principle that you go over in your training. Yeah.
So that is leading up and down the chain. And that one was interesting to me because it doesn't just talk about leading your employees or leading down the chain.
Yeah.
But it talks about leading up to, so your boss. So we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
So leading up and down the chain is really about helping your employees do what you expect them to do and be, productive and effective and all those things. And also getting them to where they want to go in a way while being aligned with the overall mission. But leading up the chain to me is all about making sure that my boss is seeing what he needs to.
Yeah.
That he has the resources and the information available so that he can make the right decisions.
I think a big thing too is that there's like that tone is set that we were in it together.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to receive it can be perceived as criticism or perceived as second guessing, but if everybody's bought in, it's like you don't have time for that. We want to be successful together.
And I love the way that he talks about it with frontline troops and stuff, because from my perspective in business, how many times does something take place where decisions are made at a higher level and it gets maybe communicated but very filtered in a way where I am pushing the mail cart and I'm not understanding why all of a sudden I have to change my loop around,
Yeah.
Because it just says, Rick, go do this now instead of that. And so we forget to communicate why the decision was made and how it will better us as a team. Because it's not necessarily about will it better that person. Because sometimes there needs to be some sacrifice there for the team to be better.
Yeah.
But it's more about that person being able to connect the dots on why he's doing it.
Yeah.
And how it's impacting the team. Because once you have that, now all of a sudden they're bought in and they can take ownership.
Yeah.
And that's a key thing of the book too, is not just me taking ownership, but helping my people take ownership.
Yeah.
And you have to give something up, and that's empowering them. And maybe including them in certain conversations, in the planning, in decision making, those things. And one of them is also leading down by giving them the information of why decisions are made.
Yeah.
And why we're going to do this.
Yeah, it's so helpful. And it might be a generational thing, but I feel like millennials, even just statistically speaking, a lot of people, they want to feel like a sense of belonging. And I think all across the board, I think all generations would appreciate why decisions are made. And I think it's just, it's a very empowering book and philosophy. And he wrote a follow-up book about extreme ownership. Just he kind of gets into more holistic look at it too. Just you don't want to be too extreme or you lose your mind a little bit. But it's good.
That'd be good for me to read because I'm about to lose it.
No, you're not. So but Jocko Willink, he has a podcast as well, and his book is really good. And anything else before we wrap up that come to mind on those principles that between personal life and business life that you think is?
I think if you want some improvement somewhere, if you know that wherever you're currently at, you're somehow unsatisfied with something, take ownership first. Yeah. And deal with it. You have to deal with it. Yeah. But ownership gives you initiative.
Yeah. And I think it's like with ownership too, it's just being introspective, say what went wrong, and even just being in tune with like how did it make me even feel? Like why was this frustrating? Is this really important to be upset about? Yeah. And then just kind of like, I mean, from a simple standpoint, why was I late at work today? Or why did I not work out? Just look at it and take ownership of it. And then obviously there's a lot more important things than that. But just being introspective and figure out what can make this situation better.
Yeah, don't blow up at your boss that you were late because you burned your toast.
Yeah.
Say, I kept my toast in the toaster too long.
Yeah. Yeah, and that actually builds trust. And that's one thing. Jocko, in the beginning of his book, and we'll wrap it up, but he gets into it's like how he thought he was going to be done when after the firefight.
That's a credibility thing.
And he was like, he thought he's going to be done. He's going to be stripped. He worked so hard to be a commander, but he thought he's going to go bottom rung. But actually, I think when you're in an environment where people trust each other and you just tell the truth, and I think at the end of the day, we all know that when we tell the truth, it's just much better.
Yeah.
And and then you deal with the consequences as they are, and sometimes they're embarrassing, sometimes it's okay, but when you're in a good environment, that's why the message is so important, is that if not only societally if people can adopt this, but also corporately if people can adopt that in a corporation, it can be so helpful to be.
And that's the key thing. Don't go after what feels good. Yeah. That's easy. Right? And it's a discipline, and there's a reason it's a discipline, because it's just that it's not easy. Yeah. And it doesn't feel good. Yeah. It's hard. Yep. But it's the right thing. Short term it doesn't feel good, but long term I'm so thankful when we take the harder choice, more disciplined choices, because it creates more freedom because you know what's going on. So yeah. Rick, thank you so much. Thank you, Jason. And I'm going to do this on my own. I don't know if Rick will agree with it, but if Rick can be a resource, he's been really helpful to me. So shoot a message to him and on LinkedIn or wherever. He'd love to grab coffee with you. So I'll pay for it. First 5 coffees, I'll pay for it. All right. That's a deal. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Rick, for joining us. Yep. And it was very insightful. And thank you for having me. Yeah. So, all right. Thanks so much. Yep. So.